Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion entitled New Data on Clinician Learning. What does it mean for your CME programs? In terms of some housekeeping, the phone lines will be muted, so please do submit your questions in the tab box in the lower right-hand console. We will get to as many as we can during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar. Also, please do complete the brief survey at the end of the webinar. Your feedback is greatly appreciated. And finally, we will notify each of you next week when the on-demand version of this program is available. So welcome again. I am your host, Jeremy Lundberg, CEO of EthosCE Learning Management System. EthosCE is an enterprise-level learning management system that has been specifically developed and designed to streamline and automate the delivery of CME by health systems, academic centers, and medical specialty associations. So our discussion today will focus on the use of social media as a learning platform within the healthcare professions. For many of us, social media applications such as Facebook, LinkedIn, and Twitter have become a part of our daily personal lives and are also powerful marketing tools within our professional lives. However, despite social media's prominence, little is really known about how, one, social media is currently used by healthcare providers as a learning tool within their practice, and two, how CME organizations can leverage social media to advance their professional education programs. So today I've invited my friend, Dr. Brian McGowan, who is the co-founder and chief learning officer of Archimedix, to share his new data on clinician learning and explain its implications upon the future of CE in the health professions. Brian is a research scientist and educational technologist and has led Pfizer's medical education group and previously served in educational leadership roles at Health Answers, Cephalon, and Wyeth. In addition, he has taught graduate medical education programs at Arcadia University for 10 years, or had taught for the past 10 years. Brian, welcome, and thank you for joining us today to discuss such a timely and salient topic.
Thank you, Jeremy, and thanks to everyone who's joined us. As far as Jeremy's introduction goes, we'll be beginning with social media, but I hope to explore a lot more about some other data sets we've recently aggregated. For those who don't know me or know how to get in touch with me, you can find my contact information on the first slide, and please don't hesitate to reach out if you have any questions and follow up to the webinar. I'd also suggest for those participating that if they want to tweet out questions to Jeremy or I, feel free to use the established hashtags MedEd or CME Chat, and we'll try to monitor those as the conversation progresses. The story that I'm going to tell today over the next half an hour or 45 minutes is one with three acts. The first focuses on data that we've collected around how clinicians are using social media as part of their lifelong learning. The second explores how physicians anticipate their participation in CME taking shape in 2014. And the third looks at the process of learning, or the actions and supporting behaviors that clinicians participate with or participate in as they're engaging with medical education. So I'll introduce each of these three parts of the story, and then hopefully we'll have time to explore through interview and Q&A at the end how these data may practically be applied to improve your educational program. Now, the first act of this three-part play focuses on the social media elements, as Jeremy alluded to, and I posed that in a general question. The general question I began to ask myself a few years ago, really as an element of scientific curiosity as much as anything else, was how are clinicians leveraging these new media in meaningful ways to support their lifelong learning. And the structure for this talk will repeat itself three times. So the initial question around this first act is, how are they leveraging, clinicians leveraging social media? what I'd like to do is introduce 3 simple polling questions to help each of us reflect and assess our own understanding of how clinicians may be using social media. So with that, I'll bring up the first question. Now that question, the question focuses on what percentage of clinicians are using Twitter as an element of their lifelong learning. So let's give you 3 or 4 seconds to answer that question. Okay. Thank you for the folks at Jeopardy for that theme song. Close the poll here. And data, and I'll hit the share button. Okay, so it looks like about 45% of the folks voted that 7% of clinicians are using social media, and then that ran the gamut all the way up to the 27% of folks who said they have no idea. And we'll explore that specific data point in a second. I'm going to go back over to the slides. Okay, so now as we move through that first element, let me see if I can do this, Jeremy. Apologize for the, see if we can do the polling question. So we've moved down to the second polling question, and we'll launch that. So now the question is, what percentage of clinicians are using restricted online networks as an element of their lifelong learning? Now, restricted online networks, I'm referring to things like CME or Osmosis, or their society's websites. All right, we'll close the poll out and share. And Jeremy, can you confirm that you can slowly see the slides? Can you see the data, yes. Jeremy? Has it appeared yet?
I do, yes.
So it looks like 35% of respondents believe that 21% of physicians are using restricted networks, and again, 29% of respondents have no idea. Not surprising, this is relatively new data. So we'll move to the third question. And here we're looking at how clinicians believe, or do clinicians believe, that social media improves the quality of care that they provide. So what percentage of physicians believe learning through social media improves the quality of care they provide? All right, we'll close the polling out, share that. And again, 26% don't know the answer to that question. We'll see if we can move that needle in a little bit. 29% believe it's 10%, and 21% believe that 40% of clinicians believe social media can make them a better clinician. So I want to restate the question as a problem. Despite the recent buzz around the emergence of social media in healthcare, the reality is that we have little definitive data on meaningful use of social media by healthcare professionals. So some colleagues and I set out about a year and a half ago, and we wanted to answer that question. We wanted to try to solve the problem, and we wanted to generate that definitive data set on clinicians' use of social media as an element of the lifelong learning. And here's how we did that. Utilizing an IRB-approved study, this was distributed to a random sample of U.S. oncologists and primary care clinicians. We were able to survey approximately 500 clinicians from around the country and explore which platforms, social media platforms, they've currently adopted for their lifelong learning. That was a key element. And then try to understand which attitudes impact those adoption patterns. So we have a descriptive data set, and then we have a predictive data set. For the descriptive data set, which is apparently hidden, Let me unhide it. Okay, let's try that again. For the descriptive data set, we're going to focus on the red and the green columns. The red column are clinicians who adamantly state that they will never use these platforms for their lifelong learning, and the green column are the clinicians who state that they are currently using said platform for the lifelong learning. And if we focus on the blue arrows towards the bottom of the slides, we can identify three of the maybe most widely understood social media platforms, that being Facebook, Twitter, and these restricted online communities, again, like Osmosis and Sermo and others. And if we remember the first question, what percentage of clinicians are using Twitter as part of their lifelong learning, the number is close to 7%. 7% of all the physicians we interviewed stated that they currently adopted Twitter, and that could be compared against 33% of clinicians who say they never will. The second question we asked is about what percentage of clinicians have utilized restricted networks or online communities of practice. And here we can see in the green bar that 51% of clinicians have readily adopted these restricted communities of practice as part of their lifelong learning versus 5% of clinicians who say they never will. One thing to take away from this data is that social media in general is really made up. It's the sum of their parts. So if you're going to describe physicians utilizing, or clinicians more broadly utilizing social media, it's really essential that you identify the specific platform that you really mean to refer to. So anywhere from 7% of clinicians are using Twitter up to 51% of clinicians are using these restricted communities of practice. Now for the attitude data, we asked a series of validated questions to try to identify what the predictive elements are that lead a clinician to adopting social media. One of them was around a clinician's attitude towards whether social media is a waste of time or essential use of time. Now, we asked about 7 or 8 of these attitudinal questions. I'm just going to share the data on 2, and you'll see a general theme emerge. About a third of clinicians, primary care and oncologists, believe that social media as an element of their lifelong learning is essential use of time. About 1 in 5 clinicians believe it's a waste of time. And nearly half the clinicians that we surveyed believed that they were neutral on the position of whether social media is a waste of time or essential use of time. Now the next slide looks almost identical, but now we're asking, do you believe social media as an element of your lifelong learning is a source of low quality or a source of high quality information? The trends continue. About a third of the audience believes that social media is a source of high quality information. About 1 in 5 believe it is a source of low quality information, and roughly half of the audience believes that they're currently neutral when it comes to this question. So these attitudes, this huge movable middle, 50% of clinicians are unsure as to the value proposition of social media. That's something we as the CME profession could leverage to our advantage. We could help clinicians move one way or the other way. If we continue to implement social media elements as part of our educational program, and those social media elements are not well structured, well designed, or having the impact that we hope they can, we may actually be moving the clinician population over to the blue. If we're leveraging social media in a way that clinicians understand that it's actually improving their learning and it's adding value to their professional careers, then we may be able to move the clinicians over to the green. It's part of the obligation, I believe, that the CME profession has in this regard. The last attitudinal question I want to share today is related to that third question we asked, around what percentage of clinicians believe social media improves their patient care. And if we just look at the green box, regardless of how the question was posed, do you believe social media improves the quality of your care? Do you believe it enables you to care for your patients more effectively? Do you believe it enables you to accomplish your job more effectively? Approximately 55 to 60% of clinicians believe that social media could make them a better clinician, could improve their patient care. This is something we should be able to leverage too. There really isn't much data demonstrating objectively that social media improves patient care. So it's data like this kind of self-report perception data that really is the best thing we have right now as it relates to clinicians, the value proposition of social media for clinicians. So with that, I'm going to move to the second act of this three-part story. And here, this is a separate data set that was captured over the last 8 months. And here, the general question we posed was, how do clinicians expect to participate in CME in 2014? And as we did in the first part, let me begin with a few basic polling questions to help each of us reflect and self-assess. So the first question relates to what you believe the basic trends are in clinician CME preference. A trend away from live CME meetings, a trend towards online. I'll give you a few seconds to answer that question. All right, let me close the poll, and I'll share the data. And it appears that about 67% of those on the webinar believe it's all of the above, 12%, so smaller groups believe that it's one of the individual trends that's stated in the beginning. Let's move to the second question here. Okay, here we're asking what percentage of clinicians believe that their participation with online CME specifically will decrease over the next 12 months. Again, we'll give you a few seconds to answer the question. All right. Let's show the results. And it appears 65% of those answering the question believe it's 3%. 19% have no idea. And so we'll take a deeper dive into this question around 2014 preferences for CME by going back over to the slides. Again, we're going to restate the problem. The problem is that educational design must include a rationale for delivering content in ways that learners prefer, but unfortunately we have little comparative evidence to support these planning decisions. So our goal was to begin to understand learner preferences in more comparative ways, and then again to try to understand what's factoring into those preferences. So about a dozen separate needs assessments surveys were conducted in partnership, Archimedics in partnership with Academic CME. These were distributed to nearly 10,000 subscribers of Elsevier journals or past participants of Elsevier-sponsored CE. Each survey targeted a different audience. It was related to a specific needs assessment, but there was a core set of questions that carried across all the surveys. Participation in the surveys was incentivized by Elsevier. And we received more than 800 responses across more than a dozen specialties and healthcare professions. So what we learned from these surveys at the highest level is that it gave us the ability to identify these general trends. So what you're looking at now is the summative data of over 801 respondents answering the question, in the coming year, what changes do you expect as it relates to your participation in medical education? And this was posed to them as, do you expect to participate more, the same, or less across these 6 elements or these 6 forms of medical education delivery? On the leftmost side of the chart is traditional online CME, cases and webinars or videos. On the rightmost side of the chart is mobile-based or mobile CME activities using smartphones. One thing to notice as a general trend is how the blue line diminishes moving from the left to the right, from traditional to online virtual courses to local meetings, national meetings, and international meetings, and how the red line slopes up from the left of the figure to the right of the figure, suggesting that for traditional online CME, 97% of respondents in these surveys believe that their participation will increase or at least stay the same in 2014. Now compare that to national or international meetings, where someplace between 20 and 40% of respondents believe that their participation will decrease in 2014. Now this was the biggest rolled up data set. What's interesting is as we broke the data set down a little bit more specifically, and we looked more granularly at elements like, does a clinician's specialty impact their preferences or their anticipated participation? And you'll see it really doesn't. Just to simplify the data, on the left side of the slide, you're looking at a variety of clinician specialties answering the question around their participation in traditional online CME. And on the right side of the slide, you're looking at the same variety of specialties, but now they're answering the question about their participation in national CME meetings. And just look at the general trends. A lot of tall blue lines on the left and a lot of red lines appearing on the right. A lot of clinicians believe, regardless of specialty, that their engagement with online CME will maintain or increase in 2014. And when it comes to national meetings, though there's some variation, there's a much stronger trend towards decreasing participation amongst these specialties. Now, we did the same thing with practice location. On the left side of the slide, you're looking at the audience broken up into urban practicing, suburban practicing, or rural practicing clinicians. And on the right side, you're looking at the same data, but now their preferences or their anticipation related to national CME meetings. So regardless of specialty, the trends maintain, and regardless of practice location, the same trends are maintained. So as we started to ask ourselves why this is, there was one element of the data that we collected that really struck us, and that is this illustration on the screen now. If we ask the clinicians on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being wholly ineffective and 10 being wholly effective, describe how effective you believe each of these educational or practice support vehicles is, you'll notice that CME meetings and online CME hold a distinctly different place in the consciousness of our clinician learners. When comparing CME meetings to online CME meetings, there's a significant increase in the number of clinicians who believe they are more effective. Now, I want you to focus on the y-axis, because to make this point, I've stretched the y-axis out so you can see the significance. It is clearly significant that CME meetings and online CME are held in different regard than guideline dissemination, practice support tools, team-based care tools. But if we collapse the y-axis back down again, and we use the full continuum from 0 to 10 on the scale that was provided, you'll see that overall, clinicians have a less than optimistic view of CME meetings, online CME, broad guideline dissemination elements, that across the board, only CME through online or live meetings ranked higher than a 7 on this scale of 1 to 10, suggesting that across the board, there's a lot more that we could be doing to instill in our learners a sense of appreciation, of optimism, a sense of belief that the CME activities that they're participating in actually are effective in improving or adding value to their professional development. Our third act in the story focuses on data that was captured even more recently. This is data that we at Archimedics began capturing just about a year ago and have continued to capture over the last year. And here the question we asked is, do you believe your learners know how to learn? It's a very simple question, but one that we found hadn't been asked, certainly hadn't been answered by many people in the CME profession previously. So as we did with the first two acts in this play, I want to offer an opportunity to reflect and to self-assess by proposing three new questions. Now, the first question that I'm asking focuses on, when it comes to learning overall, what grade would you give your learners? Do you believe they know how to learn? We'll give you a little bit of time to answer that question. Okay. Close the poll, share your results with you. It looks like about 41% of those responding believe that the answer is their learners are B learners, and about 50% believe their learners are C learners. We have one or two optimistic souls who believe their learners are A learners. So we'll move to the second poll question. Okay. This time we're asking, when it comes to participating in CME, what percentage of your physician learners, clinician learners more broadly, identify as note takers? Okay. Close this out and share the results with you. And there was a very interesting spike right at the end. For a large period of time where the votes were coming in, the answer number one, 15%, was close to 80% of the people who answered it. And then it justified itself right near the end. So it looks like more than half of the individuals believe that note-taking is a less than ubiquitous skill set for their learners. They don't believe that many of their learners take notes. And we're going to move to the third reflection question. Here, we're turning the question to true self-reflection. What grade would you give yourself when it comes to reflecting and re-exposing yourself to your own learning notes? Close the poll out, and we share it. This is a group that thinks very highly of themselves. 51% of the learners believe that they deserve a B when it comes to their note-taking and their reflection on their notes. 25% give themselves a C. So as we did with the first two acts of the play, we're going to restate this question as a problem. And the problem is that while educational planners are increasingly leveraging adult learning theory into their planning, they broadly continue to assume that learners know how to learn. This is a problem that we identified very early on in the launch of the Archimedics learning models, and so I want to dig a little bit more deeply into what we found. So we implemented more than 200 semi-structured interviews with clinicians, medical educators, residents, and medical students. The interview model began with a scenario where we asked those that we were interviewing what they do, what's the process that they apply to the learning that they're engaging with as part of continuing medical education. And then as we started to identify themes, the interview model was refined, and eventually future interviews were used to validate these original themes. So fairly typical qualitative approach to exploring this question. And here's what we learned. we learned through these 200 interviews that there are 4 broadly acknowledged actions that clinicians feel they need to take while they're engaging with medical education content. Clinicians acknowledge that learning experiences in which these 4 learning actions failed, or learning experiences that failed to support these 4 learning actions, were hit or miss at best. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time, maybe 5 or more minutes, focusing through each of these learning actions, and then trying to understand how we could apply this to our own practice. And as we're doing that, we'll touch back on those 3 questions that we just answered. So the first learning action is note-taking. 85% of the clinician learners that we interviewed self-identified as being a note-taker. 85%. Though they broadly acknowledge that they struggle overcoming this jerry-rigged system where sometimes they're using notebooks and other times they're using index cards or post-it notes or spare paper or pads, or increasingly iPads or their computers. They're sending themselves emails. They're trying to create a note-taking structure that supports their learning. And the 15% of clinicians who adamantly claimed to not be a note-taker, after some subsequent questions, actually admitted that they used to be a note-taker, but they never figured out how to do it effectively. And over time, they basically just walked away from this acknowledged obligation of learning, this natural learning action. And they determined to themselves that the best they can do is try to take 1 or 2 important things away from a CME activity because they just don't know how to process the rest of the information. The second learning action is this need to take reminders, to set and revisit the notes over time. Clinicians acknowledge that an inability to reflect on their notes and lessons undermines their ability to learn or take action. Once they're engaging with the educational content, they understand they need to take notes, but 5 minutes, 5 days, or 5 weeks after they've left that educational activity, they broadly acknowledge that they never go back and revisit those notes. In the case of the people who've logged into this webinar, 53% of you give yourself a B when it comes to your ability to revisit your notes efficiently, integrate them back into your practice, go back to the office and do something differently. In our data set of over 200 clinicians we interviewed, the average grade the clinicians gave themselves for re-exposing themselves to their learning, reflecting on their notes, the average grade was a D- or an F. Fundamentally undermining the educational experience if you expect the learners to be able to walk out of the educational activity memorizing instantaneously, photographically, everything it was that you meant to teach them. Even if you're teaching them through case studies, even if you're presenting them with problems that you believe relate to what they see every day in practice, the reality is, if the clinicians do not record and archive that initial cognitive thought, the initial cognitive process as they're trying to capture what it is that they're listening to, and if they do not go back and reflect on that initial seed of learning by revisiting and reflecting on their notes, that learning is unlikely to occur. Even the clinicians understand that this undermines the value proposition of continuing medical education. They lack this simple system for re-exposing themselves to their learning and reflecting on what they've begun to learn. The third learning action that we uncover through these interviews is this need to answer new questions as they arise. As clinicians are engaging through a webinar like this, or they're participating in a live meeting, as they're listening to that primary content, the lecture or the slides or the notes or the interactions from the podium, they're constantly asking themselves new questions. Does this relate to what do I do in practice? How do I integrate it into practice? What am I missing? Clinicians, as they're engaging in your educational programs, are in this tug of war. Are they more curious about the new questions that are emerging, or are they more curious in trying to follow the story that you intend to tell them? As they raise new questions, they begin this search process. How do I find the answers to these new questions? And what it turns out from our research, that this tug of war becomes a source of distraction. If they're in a live meeting, they've got to pull out their smartphones or their iPads or their computers. If they're sitting in front of their desktop engaging in online CME, chances are they've got a second or third or a fourth browser window open, and their journal, they're looking on PubMed, or they're going to a journal table of contents, or they're going to Wikipedia. This tug of war between new questions as they emerge and following along with the story that you developed and packaged for them is significantly undermining the impact of the medical education program, because right now the learners have to develop their own search structure. They have to understand how to go ask these new questions, where to ask them, and they have to understand how to validate information so they're getting their answers from the right places. The fourth learning action that we uncovered is a new, subtle new form of social learning, where in traditional social learning theory, learners look to other learners that they identify with, and when they have identified and they believe that these learners share similar experiences, then they are comfortable in the setting enough that they can begin asking these other learners questions. So what do you do in your practice? Do you believe what Dr. Lundberg just said? Is that what you see? And that's the traditional form of social learning. What we found through our research is that clinicians are also interested in understanding how other learners learn. So in a live meeting setting, they look to the left and the right, they scan the room, and as other people start taking notes, that activity of other learners serves as a trigger for them that maybe they should start taking a note. And as they read through notes, or they're looking at slides and certain things are being highlighted, and they look to the right and the left of them, and learners are attentive or inattentive, that degree of engagement serves as a trigger to the other learners in the room. So there's this behavioral component of social learning that's not really well described in the literature. So a thing for you to consider is, are you supporting the ability for learners to actively engage with one another in traditional social learning theory models, or are you providing the opportunity for learners to leverage these new subtle forms of social learning? Now, I'd like to summarize this third act of the story, because there really is a challenge here from our data set. And the challenge is that while educational planners have historically developed and increasingly developed content that is evidence-based and framed by or grounded in adult learning theory, and as educational planners are increasingly delivering their education through delivery models and delivery formats that are evidence-based and grounded in adult learning theory, there's really been no push, no broad understanding in the CME community as to the process of learning. So remember that as we ask these interviewees, now that you've identified note-taking as being essential to your learning, and you've identified setting reminders as being essential, you've identified the secondary need for search as being critical to your learning, what grade would you give yourself? How competent do you feel you are when it comes to taking notes, setting reminders, conducting search? And the average grade that clinicians gave themselves was about a C- for taking notes. As we mentioned, it was about a D- or an F for using those notes and setting efficient reminders. It was also about a D or a D- for the ability to search through information, finding the best answer, and doing that in a efficient time that doesn't distract them from the primary content that they're engaging with. The learners that you're educating admit that these learning actions are essential to their engagement with medical education content. This is what they're doing when they're engaging with your content, whether you are aware of it or not. But those same learners do not feel like they are equipped, have trained in, or are readily skilled as learners. I want to say that again. The clinicians that we're educating in our medical education programs, when they begin to acknowledge that there is a process of learning that they understand to be critical to the value proposition of continuing education programs, those same learners admit that they are not competent in the skills required to do this effectively. So it's beholden upon the education community to begin to consider, beyond simply creating and delivering content, how we can begin to build a structure that supports our learners in the process of learning. With that, Jeremy, we've walked through these three different acts. A basic overview of the meaningful use data that we've collected around social media being applied as a lifelong learning outlet. Then we've looked at a more recent data set on how clinicians are leveraging or expect to leverage different CME formats in 2014. And then we spent a little bit more time focused around these natural learning actions, this new data set, and how clinicians acknowledge these needs for the process of learning, but then also admit that it's not something they've thought through enough, not something they've evolved. And therefore, in many ways, they're kind of stuck behind the 8 ball when it comes to taking these actions as they're engaging with your content. So, Jeremy, let me turn it over to you, and maybe we can get into the interview or the Q&A part of the webinar.
Sure, absolutely. And I would like to encourage everyone to, email in your questions that you may have for Brian. But Brian, wonderful research and data that you've collected and presented here today. Some of what you were discussing, really makes me think about that this really could be a significant paradigm shift in terms of the construction and development of and educational planning overall. Can you talk a little bit about so where does a CME organization begin, given this data, to leverage some of the data and findings that you presented here today?
Well, I think, as G.I. Joe used to say, right, knowing is half the battle. So understanding and maybe even validating some of these data sets with your own learners to give your organization the perspective around what the learners are or are not doing, what the learners are or are not expecting moving forward. I think that's critical. I think the other takeaway is around the data. So is your organization collecting the right types of data, asking the right types of research questions, utilizing the right types of methodologies so that they can draw definitive conclusions like the ones that we're drawing here? Those are the two things I'd start with is can you collect the data that validates these questions, these research problems, or can you begin to ask your own research questions and implement the right types of methodologies to answer them?
Sure. And one other thing is questions are coming in from the audience. Is that who would you think would be the stakeholders that should be at the table? Because this really sounds like it needs to be a strategic shift in thinking and planning within the organization.
So the question is about the CME office, right? Who who needs to be brought in to manage this paradigm shift?
Yes. Or even with educational partners.
Sure. You know, I think the key to making these changes, to switching the culture in your organization, to being data driven, to asking the right questions, kind of the seeds lie in the same things we believe we do for needs assessments, right? It's about the curiosity. It's about understanding where assumptions lie and which assumptions have been borne out to be truthful. So the way we like to do it in our organization, the way I've done it in other offices, is that the first thing I do is try to generate a culture of questions, right? So what you find quite frequently is that it's not the titles that need to be seated around the table. You don't need the chief this and the director of X and the vice president of Y or the dean of W. What you need is seated around the table the people who are just inherently wired to be curious. And if you build a culture in your organization that allows questions to be asked, that is open to piloting different approaches, then I think you'll find that almost every decision you make in your educational planning process, from what the right audience is, to what the right delivery is, to what the sixth question in the evaluation needs to be, each of those questions are probably based in either an assumption or they're based in a belief that since we've always done it this way, someone years ago must have understood why that was the best approach. So I think it's not about the butts that need to be in the seats at the planning table. It's about making sure that whoever is at the planning table is empowered to ask questions and challenge the status quo.
Great, wonderful. And just want to have you field a couple of questions here. One is which are the 4 natural learning actions relevant for both live and enduring activities?
The 4 natural learning actions are relevant for every form of learning that exists in the development and the lifelong career of a healthcare professional. I think it's maybe easier in many ways to focus these learning actions on CE or CME, where there is, despite our claims, there is a pedagogical approach being had, where there is an intention and a goal of what learning should take place. So therefore, the learners, our intention is that the learners are moving in a very specific direction. And certainly we want to give them the flexibility to move into whatever direction they choose. They are adults after all. But if we're intending to teach, then I think it's very easy to understand the impact of the 4 natural learning actions. Whether you're sitting in a live lecture hall, whether you're sitting in front of your computer, whether you're rounding with an attending, or whether you're engaging in a study group with 7 other medical students as they're preparing for an exam, I believe, and our data bears this out to a greater or lesser degree, that these 4 learning actions are ubiquitous.
Wonderful, wonderful. And then one final question. How important is our understanding of learner preferences to the application of this research on natural learning actions?
Ask the question again, Jeremy, I'm sorry.
How important is our understanding of learner preferences to the application of this research on natural learning actions?
Well, I think it might be the same answer, right? So there are clearly other criteria, other forces being applied to clinician learners that I think we may understand as driving some of those preferences for 2014, right? Time is limited, costs are limited, budgets are limited. We're all being stretched more thinly. So I think
Sure.
the convenience, the accessibility of online learning is clearly part of it. The effectiveness is clearly another part of it. I might argue that there's a learning style, a more academic learning preference that's in the data someplace, but we'd probably have to ask a few more questions to answer that. But there is a segue, actually. If I'm going to go back to this slide. Clearly a promotional pitch here around the Alliance 2014 meeting, but I think that question you're asking about the intersection of these different data sets is one of the things we're going to try to do as part of this pre-conference. On this specific pre-conference, there's 3 pre-conferences at the Alliance meeting. This one I'm actually chairing, and it's focused on the science and application of learning and change in continuing education of health professionals. Now, this pre-conference is unique in a few ways. One of them, it's following the Learning Lab model, so it's going to be much more hands-on, much more problem-based. So the limited audience, we're only allowing 75 people to register for this, and last I heard, we're getting pretty close to capacity already. But the 75 people that are going to be participating in this Learning Lab pre-conference are not going to be coming into this session and passively listening to 3 hours of me talking, nor are they going to be listening to 3 hours of Jan Balmer or Jack Keyes or Teresa Barrett or Ken Korber or the other faculty members that are joining me. But the other unique element of this is that all of that monotonous, didactic droning on that so unfortunately happens in many of the sessions, we're going to package all of that. And prior to the January Alliance meeting, in fact, early in December, we're actually going to be creating a resource set of about 8 to 12 short 5 to 10 minute videos that allow the learners to go in to this video-based lesson center and engage in their natural learning actions around this library of videos on adult learning theory and constructive learning theory and social learning theory, the implementation science, behavioral economics. We're going to build a resource set of the prominent adult learning theories and the related fields of science that are being brought to bear in the continuing education of healthcare professionals. So I just wanted to spend a little bit of time in the final few minutes with that advertisement. I strongly suggest that you go to the Alliance's website if you plan to be in Orlando in January, and while space is still available, you register for this pre-conference, because between the flipped elements and between the Learning Lab elements, you have my solemn swear that this is going to be unlike anything the Alliance has done before. So let me turn it back over, Jeremy, to questions now that I've gotten off my soapbox.
No, that's wonderful. It sounds like a very exciting program indeed. Well, we are coming up on the end of the hour, and so I did want to. Oh, and one question that just came in regarding, is there an extra cost for the pre-conference of the Alliance?
There is. I'm unsure of what that is. I think if you go, the URL is on that page. Let me go back to that slide. So if you go to that, if you open that URL, or just go to the Alliance, acehp.org, the website, and I think the second slider is for the annual meeting, and go to the registration page. It's part of registration. I believe it may be $100 or $150 for this pre-conference Learning Lab. Now, the flipped elements of it, the video series, is going to be available to everybody for free. So as part, beginning in December, as the Alliance starts to over-communicate the upcoming annual meeting, a key element of that communication is going to be promoting this flipped classroom experience. So anyone, regardless of whether you're even going to the Alliance meeting, as long as you're an Alliance member, you'll have access. Actually, I think you can forward it on. I don't even think you need to be an Alliance member to access the Resource Center, since it's being housed on the Archimedics platform. It's broadly available and open to any learner. There is a registration as part of it so that your notes and reminders can all be organized around your learning experience, but there's no cost for the flipped part of the pre-conference.
Great. Well, Brian, thank you so much, and thank you everyone in our audience today for your time. It is greatly appreciated. Please do complete the brief survey evaluation at the conclusion of this webinar. A lot of people have asked, and the answer is yes. This program, including these slides, will be available next week on our website, www.dlc-solutions.com, but I will send out an email follow-up to all of the registrants today. And I would like to encourage you all to join us next month when we will be discussing and having some panelists discuss how to drive process innovation in your CME organization using Six Sigma management tools. So that we're very excited about that as well. So thank you again, Brian, and thank you all, and look forward to having you attend next month. Take care.
Thank you.